Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast. And to this episode of HR We Have a Problem. I'm your host, Kim Seals. Today, Acadian Ventures State of Work 2021 report is officially out. As you might expect, the research shows organizations are grappling with a worsening job crisis fueled by the Great Resignation, employee burnout, and now a tug-of-war between employers and employees on what the future of work will look like. In this episode, we're breaking down key findings from the report, including how companies' recruiting functions are adapting to a constrained job market, and how the exodus from Silicon Valley has created new opportunities for tech ecosystems across the U.S. To leave you with strategies you can use to help your organization shift from merely surviving to thriving once again. Joining me to help you better understand these macro trends impacting the future of work, he is the founder and general partner of Acadian Ventures, the former vice president of corporate development and strategy at Cornerstone On Demand, one of the foremost experts in human capital management, whose work is regularly featured in The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. Welcome to the show, Jason Corsello.
Hey, Kim. Good morning. It's great to be with you.
Now, don't let that intro go to your head.
I think it's just a suggestion. I'm getting old.
And you've got a long history of things we can talk about today, so I'm excited to jump in. And I know originally when I reached out to you and asked you to be a guest on the show, I had read the State of Work 2021 report that you and your team put out. A super great report. Well done. But before we dive into that, I wanted to start by asking what led you to start your new fund with a focus on the future of work. Tell us about Acadian Ventures.
Yeah. So, Kim, Acadian Ventures is kind of something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. That came about during my days at Cornerstone On Demand. So when I was at Cornerstone over a 7-year period of time, I got to wear lots of different hats. But one of the things that we did during my tenure at Cornerstone is we launched a corporate venture fund, which was relatively early. Seemingly most SaaS companies have venture funds these days. But we launched a corporate venture fund in 2014, 2015. And it was the one part about the job in corporate development that I loved, but it was kind of our Google 20% time. And I would meet with founders, every year we'd meet with hundreds of founders, and I would always get the singular question of who are the VCs or the venture firms that understand work tech, HR tech, future work? And I could never come up with a singular person or firm. And both you and I know this is a huge market, future work as a category. And I thought there was just an interesting opportunity to create a highly specialized fund, similar that we have fintech focused funds. Why isn't there one for work tech and HR tech? And so I just thought there's a gap in the market. Why not fill it? And that's what we've been doing over the last almost 3 years now.
That's awesome. How many future of work tech startups have you invested in so far?
So in our first fund, we have 16 portfolio companies today. Right now, we're on the pace of investing into somewhere in 10 to 12 per year, typically early stage, so seed stage companies, but we've done some later stage investments as well.
That's terrific. And as we go through the report and some of the findings of that report, I'm looking forward to you sprinkling in some words of wisdom about the companies you've seen along the way.
That sounds good. And I'd love to share some of our portfolio companies for sure.
Awesome. So let's talk about the report. Tell me about any surprises. When you and your team were putting this together, what 3 or 4 things in the report surprised you the most, or maybe weren't exactly what you were expecting to see?
Yeah, so let me take a back step. I'm a super data geek. And so the report itself is the kind of amalgamation of lots of data from various sources out there. It could be from private data sources, public data sources. And so what you see today is kind of a bringing together data from lots of different sources over many, many months that we look at markets and trends and information, even information that the government puts out. And so specifically to answer your question, there's an easy one, which is this kind of worsening jobs crisis, right? That's not necessarily surprising. I guess what's surprising is how bad it keeps getting, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. But a couple of things that I think I wanted to call out is we're starting to rethink benefits. Traditionally, benefits was you get healthcare from your provider. Well, benefits is becoming way more complex these days. And so the need to have programs, wellness programs for mental wellness, physical wellness, financial wellness, career wellness is becoming more and more important. So that was one. I've just gotten increasingly interested in this concept of redefining benefits as we know it today. Secondarily is this widening skills gap, right? We hear it, we see it, we've been talking about it for a very, very long time. But what's interesting is the skills gap keeps getting worse. We're throwing more technology, isn't necessarily solving the problem. But if you start to look out 20 or even 30 years from now, where we're going to start to see in kind of the 2050, 2060 timeframe, a decline of the global work population, the skills problem is going to get even worse as we see, less workers because that working population actually starts to decline. In areas like China, we're going to see a declining working population. In Europe, it's going to get a lot worse because that working population will continue to decline. So the skills gap is becoming more complex because you're now bringing into play hard skills versus soft skills. And soft skills are becoming, in some cases, are becoming more important than hard skills. And let me just say one last thing in terms of the surprises. We're in kind of what I think is now a third evolution or generation of technology. And a lot of technology that we use today is designed for the past, not necessarily for the future. And we can go deeper into that. But I see a big gap in terms of our technology today and kind of a redefinition of the technology and how the technology is architected kind of going forward, the needs for organizations.
I want to zero in on a couple of things you just talked about. There's so much here to break down, but what I've seen out there in the workforce is that the financial wellness piece is directly affecting the mental wellness piece. As individuals are worried about their financial status, worried about their future, where they're headed, do they have enough saved for retirement? And that is weighing on them and, creating anxiety and creating concerns that ultimately end up affecting your physical well-being too. So, hopefully we'll see some folks approaching this from multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree.
Also follow up on the comment you made about technologies being built for the past rather than the future. Tell us a bit more about that and what you meant there.
Yeah, so let me unpack that a little bit. So when I said third generation, I think what we've seen is kind of the first generation of technology was kind of this ability to build on-premise software, highly customizable. The last decade or kind of 10 to 15 years has been this shift to the cloud, automation of processes, not necessarily changing a lot of them, but putting them in the cloud, making it much more efficient and scale, making software much more configurable. And I think we're now entering this third generation, which is you kind of need both, right? So you need this ability to create highly scalable technology solutions, leveraging common infrastructure. But what's been missing is this ability to kind of create this customization specific to an organization, to personalize to the organization. And so that's where I start to see this third generation is leveraging data, leveraging AI, which we've been talking about for the last decade, but doing it in a much different way. A lot of people call it open platform. There's a new term more recently called no code or low code platforms. That's to me, which is where I've been spending a lot of time. We just made an investment in a company called Assembly. And it's this ability to really flex your technology, right? Because I think what we've seen, at least over the last 12 to 18 months, is what we need is flexibility, right? We need adaptability, both in our people as well as our technology. And so that's been missing, I think, a lot of the traditional enterprise software solutions is they don't have that flexibility. They don't have that ability to say, hey, we got to change on the fly here. And our technology needs to adapt. And to do it with just a person versus having to bring in a third party consultancy and spend hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. And so, long response to your question, I see the future as kind of low code, no code, open platform technology where you can easily integrate different solutions together. And that's been missing as companies have rushed to the cloud.
For sure. Yes, that trip to the cloud was not an easy one for some companies, and now they don't really know what to do now that they're there, right?
Yeah, now that they're there, and guess what? Like the world's changed. And
I took all this
now,
time to get to the cloud, and now everybody's gone. They're off somewhere else to the next big great thing.
Yeah, well, the thing that's happened is the organizations have changed, right? Where now we're using more freelancers and contingent workers. Now we're not going to the office today. We're living in a hybrid world, or in some cases, we're in a remote first world. So it's gotten way more complex just in the last 1 to 2 years. But our technology in many cases hasn't been able to support this new way that we're working in the future.
Last point I want to circle back to on your surprise is something that I'm super passionate about, which is the skills gap. And, one of the things that has surprised me about this is how surprised organizations are that they have a gap, right? I mean, we've been talking about the skills gap forever. It feels like that train that's been coming down the tracks at us for years. And it seems like most organizations did nothing to get ahead of that. Like, we know organizations that haven't even begun to measure the gap yet, to figure out where they're lacking skills, to do that work, to say, what do I need in the future that I don't have today? Are you in the same place I am where you're surprised that people are surprised?
Yes, but we shouldn't be surprised, I guess, is the short answer, because I think this is one of these areas that we expected technology to solve the problem. And the fact is you actually have to go back and do real work to see, like, what are the skills that we need in our organization, and how do those skills line up to the jobs within our organization. So there's actually work that organizations need to do before they decide, hey, we're going to go either use our existing technology or go buy a new technology solution out there. So I think that's what's been missing, is the behind the scenes work that then to say, okay, once we have figured out the skills, how they map to careers, how they map to jobs, they're certainly going to be evolving. And how do you build them in a way that allows for this adaptability of those skills and those jobs? And I think that's just that real work, a lot of cases, hasn't been done, and certainly hasn't been done over the last 18 months as people have just been trying to tread or stay above water to make sure their companies can still operate.
Although that data and insights would have been super helpful during the pandemic, right? As they were thinking about their workforce of the future, and if they did need to make some difficult decisions, which employees needed to stay and which employees could they perhaps furlough or let go.
That's right. Absolutely.
As you mentioned, there are nearly twice as many job openings for every job filled. So we do have this jobs crisis. What types of new technology are you seeing out there that are helping companies solve this challenge? Again, with the caveat of what we just talked about before, which is technology is not the end all be all. It's one of those tools you use to actually solve the problem alongside some of the work that organizations have to do.
There's not an easy answer to this in terms of the technology answer. A lot of people want this kind of one single bullet, and there certainly isn't one out there. So I think, to me, it's starting to figure out what we've seen is in the last kind of couple of years, at least, even pre-pandemic, is with these talent marketplaces, right, that are trying to figure out what skills are available within your organization, find short-term or long-term opportunities that match those skills with the need. I think we're still early days in that, but talent marketplaces have been kind of slowly emerging over the last few years to match and identify talent and immediately fill high demand kind of positions or projects with skills that are available within an organization today. I think, to me, this challenge of the tight labor market is the bigger concern is being an employer of choice, right? That's where we're seeing the good companies separate themselves from the not so good companies. And what that means is, take the technology aside, is really being able to answer four things for the organization: mission, vision, culture, and values, right? Are they clearly defined? Are your employees living and breathing it every day? And is it manifested in the work and the company and even the results? And I don't think a lot of companies really can answer that question of, can my employees answer what our culture and our values are, and do they live it and breathe it every single day? I think a lot of companies need to go through that reassessment right now and say, what is our mission? How has it changed in the last 18 months? What is our vision? What is our culture? How has our culture changed? Because certainly, most cultures have changed either by design or by default in the last 18 months. And so I think a lot of companies need to go through that reassessment.
And if ever there was a time that you needed to be true to your core values and what you want the culture of the organization to be, now is it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because this is going to give yourselves a leg up in a tight labor market, right? If employees are coming to you versus you having to go out and solicit the market and get hundreds of resumes back, you'd much rather have inbound resumes versus having to post and do a spray and pray for jobs, which we see a lot of organizations do today and do it unsuccessfully.
One of these other areas where we're seeing the effect of the pandemic is on what we're calling migrating workforces, right? In this remote from anywhere environment, that's turning what we think and how we've traditionally thought about comp, geo differential rates, and what and how to pay people. That's turned it all upside down. And I know Acadian Ventures has invested in a company called Compa. Tell us a bit about what attracted you to them and how are they working to help solve some of these problems?
Well, thanks for the plug for Compa. I'm really excited about Compa. And it's interesting, when I first met the founder, Charlie Franklin, I was like, oh, I don't really love comp. Comp's complex, and globally there's all kinds of rules and regulations. But as I started to learn more about the company, the way he described the company is deal desk software for talent acquisition. Well, what does that mean? It means, in sales, as an example, we have this at Cornerstone. You have a deal desk, right? So a deal desk will say, is it priced the right way? Do we have the right terms in it? Do we have the right levers in terms of the contract? And what's been missing is that kind of centralized function for talent acquisition. So when we're really trying to facilitate the offer process or that onboarding process, we can do it efficiently. And so Compa really, to me, is ability to better manage the offer process, and more specifically is to win the candidates that you want to win, because it is super competitive. And so being able to look at compensation and understand what the variances are, for example, if you offer 10% more in base salary, does that increase your win rate for winning the candidate by X amount, by 20%, 50%? But it also allows you to roll in certain other things that are important to the organization, like diversity and inclusion. Hey, we need to improve our population for Black engineers, as an example, or female marketeers. I'm just making these things up, but start to roll in those key elements of programs like diversity and inclusion into that offer letter and compensation process very early on in that employee journey. So that's really what they're doing, and I think it's based off of a lack in the market, right? You talked about changing geos, and we hear every day about the exodus from Silicon Valley to people can work now wherever they live or want to live, and people are moving. Well, we don't have good data on that today, right? I mean, traditionally, there's lots of solutions that have labor market data, but in my mind, it's out of date by the time you're actually using it. It's not necessarily forward looking. And so, it's a way to solve that problem today, to understand we're moving to much more hybrid or remote workforces. Employees can work wherever they want now, but how do you align compensation with that? And then there's in a lot of my responses, I think there's no real kind of right or wrong answer, but I think to have a philosophy or an approach to it probably needs to be the answer for an organization.
Right. And I think some organizations may also still see this as temporary. They may not believe that remote anywhere is where they're going to end up long term. It may be where they end up short term. And as you said, there's not a lot in HR that moves fast, right? And so by the time you redo all your salary structures, you strip out all those geo differentials, it could take quite some time to figure out everyone's pay. And then the workforce is changing again, right? So it's a never ending job to stay on top of this.
Let me add one other thing, Kim, which is we've seen an explosion in the last 18 months in these. I'm not sure the right way. I'm sure the market's necessarily been defined yet, but it's kind of this idea of these global employment platforms. So essentially, this idea that you can hire someone anywhere in the world, and these platforms kind of manage everything from payroll to all of the compliance and regulations on a country by country basis. This is also, I think, the new world, which is you can hire someone anywhere in the world now. We talked about it 10 years ago, but we really weren't doing it, right? Now we're doing it, but there's platforms, and we've got an investment in a company called Oyster that does this. There's others as well, but it's really facilitating this ability to hire anywhere in the world, managing to the local markets, all of the compliance and regulatory needs, but also managing the comp and payroll side, which is just as important as everything else.
And super complex when you get outside the US, and just something that a lot of folks just didn't want to deal with and now are being forced to maybe a little faster than they wanted, because employees are moving back to where their families are, for example, and that's perhaps a different country than where you were typically or already had operations.
That's right. And we're seeing, like, developers as an example, right, as a job. Usually a lot of developers were domestically, or maybe you used India or increasingly Eastern Europe. We've got companies hiring developers in Argentina, hiring developers in Malaysia, hiring developers everywhere in the world, which you never really thought about that as an option a couple of years ago. And so you truly can hire people anywhere in the world, but we need to make it easier to do that. And there's now platforms that can do that.
So speaking of remote work, there is a rising trend in tech startups replacing their offices with Airbnbs. Tell us a bit more about what you've learned there and whether or not you think those tech startups will return to some type of normal, whatever the new normal is, those types of workplaces anytime soon.
Oh boy. Maybe me try to answer this a little bit differently, Kim, which is I think we're reaching a point now where companies need to decide where they are in the spectrum of office first or remote first. And in the spectrum, and then you've got kind of hybrid in the middle. What we've seen with most startups and many of our startups, I'd say 3 of the last 4 investments that we've made are what I would consider remote first companies, right? Where in fact, probably 2 of the last 3, we had the discussion of like, where's our headquarters? Is it where the CEO lives? Should it be in Silicon Valley? Because, it's nice to have a Silicon Valley address. And so to answer your question, in startup land, at least, we're seeing obviously embracement of remote first. Part of that is because, many of them are technology or services based companies where you don't need to be in a physical location. Those companies are used to working in a collaborative online environment asynchronously. I think the bigger question is what are the more established companies going to do? Are they going to go remote first? Are they going to go office first? I think we've seen a lot of companies trying to figure out what that right approach is. I mean, interestingly, very early on in the pandemic, or I shouldn't say early on, I'd say midway, I think a lot of like financial services companies were saying, you have to go back into the office. That's just our DNA. That's the way we work. That's the way a lot of financial services companies work. And I think what we're now starting to see is they're kind of reassessing that, because what they're realizing is they're not going to be able to recruit people to come back to the office in a lot of cases. If you think about this at the foundational level, companies need to really figure out, what are they? Are they remote first? Are they office first? Are they hybrid? And there's not any sort of right or wrong answer, but you need to answer that question before you figure out a lot of other things around usage of technology or processes that you want to redesign or hiring practices that you want to make. One thing in the report that we share very upfront is as companies went to remote work, were forced into remote work, the universal response is it worked, right? Employees liked it and employers liked it. Overwhelmingly, through a lot of data that we found externally, is it was very well received. And so remote work isn't necessarily we don't know if it's not going to work or not. Like, it's proven that it's worked. But I think the question is, was it a short-term solution, or can you really design a long-term answer or solution for your respective organization?
And some of this goes back to what you mentioned earlier about culture, right? And is remote going to fit with your culture? And we've also seen mixed reviews from employees. Some like being fully remote. Some want to be hybrid. Some want to be in the office. They like that interaction. They like that networking, that mentorship they get from being in the office. So it's definitely not easy. And to your point, doubtful there's a one size fits all answer here.
It's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine in town that his company's forcing them back into the office. And he's like, so that's great. I'm going back into the office to do Zoom calls. Like, I think you have to be thoughtful around this. Like, okay, I should go back in the office, but I should be back in the office when my team's there at the same time. And when there's really important use of that office kind of environment. And I think that's what companies are trying to think through right now is, again, I think we're still very early on in this experimentation, but it's like, I've heard companies like, oh, marketing's going to go on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and different teams going to go in on Wednesdays and Fridays. Who knows what that right answer is? I think a lot of smart companies are leaving it up to the teams and the managers to decide what works best for their group or their organization. But I'm not sure there's any right or wrong answer at this point.
And I think it'll come down to the data, right? The data on engagement, the data on retention, that ultimately we'll start to see some real data beyond just 2020 that also reflects 2021 and beyond. Historically, what we knew about engagement data, it would tell us that our remote workers were happier, but less sticky. And the folks that were in the office, sort of mired in the politics and the water cooler chit chat and all that, they were unhappier, but they stayed longer because they had colleagues and coworkers they were with every day that they really liked. And that's kind of what kept them sticky with the company. So now we'll see all that data in real time. And how's that changing?
Companies need to make the hard decision too, which is like, do you want unproductive but engaged workers, or do you want highly productive, somewhat engaged workers? And that's a hard question to answer for a lot of organizations.
Right now, many employers will say, we'll take what we can get. We have a lot of open jobs.
Exactly.
Earlier, you broke a lot of hearts in our listeners when you said, hey, there is no one single bullet that's going to solve all your problems. But we know that many of these companies that are in survival mode, that are trying to figure out these tricky talent issues, they are searching for that single or silver bullet in a tech platform. If we were to give them any sense of hope at all, where do you think there are some emerging tech trends that they should be keeping their eyes on?
The one I mentioned earlier, this kind of no code, low code environment, call it open platform, call it whatever you want. I think we're early stages there, right? But I think why I get excited about that market is one thing we have seen over the last decade is a proliferation of SaaS-based technologies. It's like, oh, we have a process maybe broken. Let's go buy a SaaS solution that solves that, right? So I think we do need to enter some sort of a consolidation approach, which is like, why do you need 4 vendors that are doing some form of performance management when you could probably get it all from one? But that one vendor should have that flexibility and customization, configurability to do unique processes. So no code, low code is a really interesting area. I've certainly got really excited about because I think it's still early, but it has the opportunity to disrupt a lot of these, incumbent markets, but provide a ton of value to organizations to reduce their costs, increase their flexibility. Gosh, I can go down the list of a lot of other technology areas, but the other one, as I mentioned, is this kind of global employment platform. It's probably been the hottest area of traditional HR tech in the last 2 years. And the idea is you can hire employees anywhere in the world. You can do it cheaply, efficiently, understanding compliance and risk. And so that's one area where I just think with companies look anywhere in the world for talent, these technology platforms enable companies to do that. Those are probably the two. I'm sure I'm missing out on others, but those are probably the two I'd love to call out.
Great advice for what to stay in touch with. Let's talk about venture capital funding in the HR tech space. It had previously been flowing in at a record pace, right? Record deals, really strong interest from VCs into this HR tech space. Where do you see it now? How is the market doing for funding for future of work companies?
If I was going to call it one word, I'd say crazy. And what I mean by crazy is there's so much capital in the market that, everyone says, oh, capital must be easy to fundraise. It still doesn't necessarily make it easier. Well, I guess in some aspects it makes it easier to fundraise, but fundraising still is hard for a lot of founders. But let me give you some data just to kind of talk through this, right? So as of this morning, I was just looking at the data this morning, there's $14.2 billion of venture capital in kind of future of work, right? So work tech, HR tech, that's everything from recruiting software to collaboration software. So 14.2 billion, that's up from just under 5 billion last year. So we're almost seeing a threefold increase of venture capital investment in the space in the last year. So there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot, more broadly speaking, there's, venture capital itself has been growing massively in the pandemic, which is interesting because if a lot of people were concerned back in April, like, oh, are investors going to keep investing? Well, the stimulus certainly helped answer that question, but there's a ton of capital rolling. Just as exciting is we've seen a kind of explosion of what everyone likes to call the unicorn companies in the last year, right? So as of today, we have 42 kind of future of work unicorn companies that are now valued at just over $110 billion.
And just for our listeners, a unicorn is a startup that is valued at 1 billion or greater. So we'll give that little factoid for those that might be wondering, what's a unicorn?
Thank you for saying that. I don't know what the number is last year, but I'd say it was probably more than half. There was probably less than 20 companies, probably even less than 15 unicorn companies. So, the number of companies that are valued over $1 billion has exploded in the last year. It shows just a lot of excitement in the market, a lot of opportunity in the market. Because I think people forget, for most organization, your human capital expenses, 60 to 70% of your overall expenditure. It's a huge number. So if you can create just a little bit of an efficiency of that number, it could have a massive impact on the organization. Let me throw one last interesting thing that I found through a lot of the research that we did is Silicon Valley was always kind of the center of technology innovation. in SaaS-based technologies, and you name it in technology. And what we're seeing in kind of future of work as a technology is there's new companies being created all over the world. What's fascinating now, of those 42 unicorn companies, only half of them are in the Bay Area. The other half of these companies are in Europe, are in Asia. And so I think this is going to be a trend we'll continue to see, is one, you can start a technology company anywhere in the world, and we're going to be less dependent on Silicon Valley as being that hub ecosystem of really cool, exciting companies.
So if you and I were hip and cool, Jason, we would say it's a frothy market right now for money flowing into venture capital, right? Isn't that the word that all the hip investors are using, frothy?
Yes, very frothy.
On that note, without debating whether you and I are hip or cool, this feels like the place to wrap up our conversation. And Jason, thanks again for joining us. Really have enjoyed having you on today, talking about all things future of work.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's really great to connect with you, and always fun to chat about this geeky stuff without being hip and cool.
Exactly. And if you all, as our listeners, want to hear more of Jason's advice, head over to acadianventures.com or follow Jason on Twitter at jcorsello. Be sure to subscribe to the HR Huddle podcast and tune in weekly to our other shows, Spilling the Tea on HR Tech with Stacey Harris, and Per My Last Email, where we dig into what's broken in diversity, equity, and inclusion with Pam Jeffords. And we'll see you in our HR Huddle.